Thank you very much, Sabah. It is great to see you, albeit virtually, since the last time at the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction in Geneva last year. Martin, in you and in IPU, we have a very valued partner to support parliamentarians across the world. And hello to our dear friend Loren, President Nasheed, Excellencies, distinguished parliamentarians, ladies and gentlemen. It was already apparent before the pandemic that the world was struggling to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, given the steep rise in climate-related disasters over the last 20 years. Actually, we know that 90% of the major disasters of the past 20 years were related to extreme weather events. And the eradication of poverty is impossible if we are losing a sizable percentage of GDP year after year to extreme weather events. Last year alone, 25 million people were forced from their homes by these extreme weather events. And the slow progress, unfortunately, on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and the inadequate level of investment in adaptation to climate change for climate vulnerable country points to major shortcomings in the governance of disaster risk. And this is where we need parliamentarians to react on now. The underlying weakness of disaster risk governance, which was globally revealed by the failure to prepare adequately for the COVID-19 pandemic, despite many warnings and the inclusion at the insistence of member states themselves of biological hazards in the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, this weakness of disaster risk governance really is the issue that we need to tackle. Moving from words to action, as many of you already have mentioned, starting with His Excellency Ban Ki-moon and Saber, moving from words to action is always a challenge, but failure to do so is too costly. The lessons learned to date from the climate emergency and the pandemic must now be applied as we strengthen both nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement and also the national strategies for disaster risk reduction under the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, because as Saber has mentioned, disasters and climate emergency are so closely linked. Parliamentarians have a crucial role to play in ensuring that these plans, NDCs, and national strategies for disaster risk reductions are realistic, and importantly, that resources are allocated to ensure that their implementation is supported, and they have to be supported by appropriate legislation and regulation. There is nothing stronger than law-based governance. Nationally determined contributions embody efforts by each country to reduce their national emissions and adapt to climate change, and the majority of them highlight disaster risk reduction as a priority. And similarly, adaptation to climate change is a constant thread that we are seeing in the already 93 national strategies for disaster risk reductions that member states have developed to date. Parliamentarians have an essential role to play in the national debates on the development of these instruments and ensuring that they are coherent and complementary. This requires a systemic and integrated approach to disaster risk and recognition that beyond climate change, there are a range of risk drivers which are also needed to be addressed through environmental protection, regulation of land use and building codes, and poverty reduction measures. As Martin has already mentioned, this approach will be reflected in the new parliamentarian toolkit for disaster risk reduction, which my organization UNDRR is developing with IPU. And this toolkit, this handbook, will be launched early next year. We look forward to working with you so that these toolkits, these guidances will be transformed into action and ensure that we can both make progress at national, local level, and the community levels. Thank you very much for your attention.